In my lectures this week, I want to draw your attention to a few salient paragraphs from your reading from Hine and Shattuck to elucidate some historical matters, noun, and to offer some comments about historical matters of consequence that are historic. History matters. The relatively slow growth of the Episcopal Church in the antebellum period is a topic I want to take up first. On page 63, Hine and Shattuck note that despite the success that most denominations enjoyed during the antebellum period, both the Episcopalians and the Congregationalists, the two religious bodies that had been legally established throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, experienced relatively slow growth, lagging behind the rise of the population as a whole. It needs to be pointed out that during the period 1790 through the 1840s, America experienced what has been called the Second Great Awakening. It was a revivalistic movement that was, in part, a reaction to the skepticism, deism, and rationalism that had given birth to the Revolution. But the pendulum had swung toward a wholesale acceptance of modern thought and new science, and those seemed to call into question one traditional belief after another. And that pendulum, from 1790 on, began to swing in the opposite direction. The evangelical zeal of the Second Great Awakening capitalized on the conditions of the advancing American frontier, the new nation's westward expansion. Immigration, exploitation, dislocation, and even loneliness, and very significantly a financial panic in 1837, darkened the American dream for many and also led to the success of the evangelistic movement that was the Second Great Awakening. Methodists enjoyed unprecedented success in this period, and by way of example, they can illustrate something about why perhaps the Episcopalians and the Congregationalists were left behind. By 1844, Methodists had become the most numerous religious body in America, with 1,068,525 members. There were 3,988 itinerant preachers, 7,730 local preachers, and an incalculable number of regular hearers in Methodist congregations. The most important factor in this amazing expansion was the system of circuits and preaching stations and the disciplined, basically autocratic ways in which they were laid out and staffed and supervised as the frontier expanded. Methodists also appropriated and made the most of camp meetings as an instrument for satisfying the social and religious impulses of an increasingly scattered population, a population possessed of a pioneering spirit. These camp meetings where people came together, congregated, heard vibrant preaching, met with other new settlers in the area, were an enormously important social force in the early 19th century. A third factor was the recruitment of its ministry from among the common people and its continuing interest in the masses. Ordination was conferred only on well-proved preachers, but these preachers were not the social elite. With little formal training to divorce themselves from the common folk, they reduced the Christian message and its implications to the simplest possible terms. They preached it simply. They made direct points about the implications for everyday life. They spoke directly and forcefully. Peter Cartwright, who died in 1872, was one of the most famous of the Methodist circuit riders. And he said, "I have seen so many educated preachers who forcibly remind me of lettuce growing under the shade of a peach tree. The other branches of the Protestant Church contend for an educated ministry, for pews, for instrumental music, for a congregational or a stated salaried ministry. The Methodists universally oppose these ideas, and the illiterate Methodist preachers actually set the world on fire, while others are still lighting their matches. A fourth factor contributing to Methodist success was the appeal of John Wesley's theology, which was at the heart of that forceful preaching by the circuit riders. That theology has been described as Arminianism set on fire. Arminian theology started with a Calvinistic stress on the sovereignty of God and the depravity of human nature. But it was leavened with Wesley's distinctive emphasis on God's prevenient grace and the sanctifying work of the Holy Spirit. All of this serves to underline and explicate a bit, I hope, why, as Hine and Shattuck lay out their subsection that begins on page 66, a sizable evangelical party surfaced in the Episcopal Church in the early years of the 19th century. That evangelical party was in part fueled by the success of the Methodism that I have just described. It was an attempt to answer some of those critiques of the established churches like the Episcopal Church and the Congregationalist churches, to find a way to appeal to the more common folk that Hine and Shattuck take up in the next section of their work. I think their explication is pretty clear. What I want to turn to in my next lecture, as the second part of this discussion of antebellum sectarianism, is the rise of distinctly American denominations in the early part of the 19th century. I'll turn to that in just a moment then.